I'm Shae Russell for mining.com.au, and it is that time of the week where we drag Mr. Data Dan Petrie away from his spreadsheets and whack a webcam in front of him and get you to put the headphones on. Data Dan, welcome to today's chat. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Shae. I'm very well.
One of these days we'll come up for a name for this actual segment, so I don't have to keep introducing you as the guy who's really good with spreadsheets.
Data rant. We'll call it data rant.
Now, today's conversation might be taking a slight shift from what we normally talk about. Maybe we can whack a chart in or two. And we're having an unstructured conversation today. My favorite. Who knows where the winds are going to take us this time? I called it the Trump dump. Let's be honest, stock markets are getting an absolute beating at the moment. Short question for you to kick off today. Where's the bottom?
Well, that's very interesting. Remember, we're in March, so we're coming to the end of the quarter. Normally, before the end of the quarter, you get a lot of pension funds and hedge funds buying up equities at a discount. If the prevailing winds are there to do so to dress up quarterly returns. So there's a school of thought to suggest that perhaps we might be nearing a bottom. Now, remember that the Dow Jones is down 0.2% last night, so basically the size of the drop is lower or smaller, so it's certainly contracted. But if you want to look at it in context, year to date, 10% down. All the gains that Mr. Trump enjoyed when he ascended to the presidency for a second time have gone. And most of that deterioration has happened in the last few weeks. So, but particularly this week, and why has it happened? Is because of that terrible U word, uncertainty, and that's really what's driving markets down. Is the rather blanket approach and kind of inexplicable approach to economic policy, and definitely dealing with allies. It's the isolationism for the Americans is not particularly new. They observed with a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine in the early part of the 20th century, where they didn't want to be interventionist in European wars. In fact, when they actually did go into the Second World War, for example, their first military conflict was with the French because they wouldn't let them dock at Casablanca. So, by and large, it's really an uncertainty sentiment play, not so much fundamentals. And so that's the psychology of markets. Picking the bottom's like harder to pick than a broken nose. But you would say that the given the fall we've seen, the smaller levels of falls in terms of percentages, you'd probably be nearing somewhere. But again, we've seen a lot of indicators recently. For example, buying of gold in Switzerland and Australia, for example, from the United States is. It's either a fantastic buying opportunity or there's definitely a hedge on about safety. So that's one reason often up, but sentiment and uncertainty within that sentiment. And also an indicator called the VIX volatility index is what we should be looking at, because what that does is it measures volatility in the market, and that has been spiking in the last few weeks.
It's interesting you say that the Dow is down about 10%. Popping on my old analyst hat here, we'd consider 10% a correction and 20% a crash. So we're right on the precipice of moving past that 10%. And are we moving into market crash territory? Time will tell. Thankfully, one of the things with the Trump administration is nothing moves slowly. So we won't be waiting too long for an answer to see how far that Dow can fall.
No, nothing moves slowly. But one thing that is interesting, though, is that these are self-inflicted wounds. Like they might, like there's an argument that there could be a buying opportunity, but the bottom line is businesses hate uncertainty, and it's like, why on earth would you invest when the economic settings and the policy settings in the world's largest economy are basically free trade agreements are now ignored? Why on earth would you invest in a country, no matter how big? That's always been part of the problem, with the Chinese economy. Is like, oh, look, we could go to China, set up a factory. It's actually incredibly difficult to do. There's a series of rather bizarre, almost rituals you have to go through. You have to be physically there to sign a document to open businesses, for example, on a particular day at a particular time. And if you're not there, it's almost reminiscent of what happened to the British when the early establishment of Hong Kong happened. They weren't there at a particular time on a particular day, and so the uncertainty always has a factor, and then what it tends to do is, you know, money goes where it's going to find a home with stability. So in the 1980s and 90s, there used to be that famous saying, "Let's put your money to work." And then, you know, when the money disappeared, we put it to work, but it just didn't work out, and we don't know where they've gone. The fact of the matter is, this markets crave stability, and this pullback we're seeing is really the fact that it's uncertainty created by policy settings which are now uncertain. And when people don't have a guarantee on a rate of return, that's what happens. And so, Mr. Trump may have come in with a tailwind of, great flow through on certain social policies in terms of, he found great favor with, attacking so-called DEI and woke. But again, those issues, for example, are not market moving so much as tariffs are. So while he may have had popularity in the social sense initially, he's now coming against the raw, hard, brutal law of arithmetic. And arithmetic in stock markets is governed by stability and central banks, of course.
Ooh, two topics we're about to tackle. Listen, money's a lot like water and it follows the path of least resistance. So it relies on the stable rule of law, which is why you pointed out it's been such a struggle for some businesses to take hold in China. But I guess that takes me to my next point, and this is the saturation of headlines. I mean, listen, mate, I'm getting whiplash from looking at different headlines every day. And I know myself, I've missed certain events that are very important to metals in the past couple of weeks. Tell me, by watching our major news companies regurgitate the same old headlines, what other events are we actually missing that really matter for the economy?
Well, industrial production across Asia, Korea, Japan, China, India. It might be, you know, for example, like we don't talk about fruit and vegetables much in a mining video, but like, but the vast majority of those exports, for example, go to India in the vegetable space. I mean, like most of the highest quality fruit that goes to Hong Kong. We have to keep the bankers fed in that part of the world with the best. Like, what are we missing? Like, there's, like trade wars tend to mask, they're really, if on a broad brushstroke, they tell a story around big numbers. On a more forensic and analytical approach, they tell a fascinating story about who's producing what, who's producing it better, and what the private sector does across country. And that is fascinating. And then what happens though, when you kind of get involved in the headline thematic, you really miss what's going on below the surface. And we're talking. Warren Buffett often uses the great line. When the tide goes out, you find out who's wearing a swimming costume. but but below the headline, there's many stories, but those stories are crowded out at the moment. And you have journalists, for example, having to react to the whims of somebody who's, like behavior, you know, you can be incredibly uncharitable and say that the behavior just doesn't make any sense. There's no pragmatic approach to these decisions, executive order after order. It's something you see in a Star Wars film. So the fact of the matter is but no, beneath the headline, there's still a story to be told about car manufacturing. There's still a story to be told about, the renewal of infrastructure around the world. I mean, in America, they might talk about making America great again. What they need to be talking about is making American roads great again. You've got bridges, and they actually have to do a whole suite. This is what Joe Biden put into law in 2022. This huge infrastructure renewal because they had bridges that were literally collapsing. And these were like projects from the New Deal era of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, like, people can invoke this stuff of capital works and all that, but that's one aspect. There's the technology aspect, and then there's also the quantum computing story, which no one seems to be talking about, why critical minerals are so important in chip making. You know, there is some very, very serious challenges ahead. And again, if it continues to kind of coalesce around this idea of what the United States president of the day does, if there can be a peace achieved in Ukraine, it seems highly likely they'll get a deal, but one which is again a redrawn Ukraine with a buffer of puppet countries created by Mr. Putin, and then and again you've got a media landscape now dominated by tribes. Conservative commentators, gleefully lap up anything Mr. Trump says, while leftist commentators, you know, rally in anger over anything Mr. Trump says. There's a complete lack of critical thought and assessment of policies which will actually fundamentally change the lives of people, not really the minutiae of personality, which is basically where our crisis in media is at the moment too, I dare say.
We're at risk of running out of time today, but there's a couple of threads that you've just said that I wouldn't mind pulling on in our next conversation. I sort of want to draw today to a close with the changing of the guard, as you will, in Canada. Now, Justin Trudeau has stepped aside, and Mark Carney is the current Prime Minister of Canada. For those who haven't seen this headline, it was buried somewhere on the internet. Now, you spoke quite highly of his experience earlier in the week in a company-wide meeting. Can you elaborate on what skill Mark brings to the table? And is this good for Canada going into an election later this year?
Okay, so Mark Carney is a former governor of the Bank of Canada. He's also the first foreign appointee to the Bank of England. He was the Bank of England governor when Brexit happened. He has a brain like a planet. Donald Trump has an ego like a planet. So you've got, the brain versus the brawn. And Mark Carney is a highly accomplished mind on economics, an incredibly shrewd individual, but he's a political novice. And the opposition leader, he has actually, he will drag the Liberal Party of Canada, much closer. He'll make them far more competitive in the polls. Uh, Although Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader there, he's great for a soundbite. He says all the right things, speaks in, slogans and threes, axe tax and carbon tax, Carney. So he's got the Tony Abbott line, and interesting enough, Tony Abbott's been quoted a lot in Canadian presses, who Poilievre's modelled himself on. Being a ruthless opposition leader might be incredibly effective, but you have to have the economic policies to counter what Mr. Trump's doing. Canada will have to impose their own tariffs against what the US are doing, but by and large, he's an incredibly accomplished central banker. It doesn't necessarily translate to being a shrewd politician, because you have to be able to have the retail touch to be able to take people with you. Now, in New Zealand, there was a central banker called Donald Brash who went up against, I think it may have been Helen Clark in New Zealand there at the general election. Now, Brash was a reforming central bank governor, drove all sorts of efficiencies, but he just didn't translate well politically in terms of, you're ultimately measured by whether you get the chocolates or not in terms of being elected to government. And Brash didn't do that. But it's not unknown for a central banker to make the jump to politics. Such a high profile central banker, such as Carney, who's, obviously strong in both North America and European economic fundamentals. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. But again, he will, if it was a pure debate on the economy, you'd think Carney would do Mr. Trump like a dinner. But this guy, Mr. Trump, does not play. He's a street fighter. He's a property developer. Like they have one thing, and it's just blunt force. This is what I want. And Mr. Trump has a supporter base that will take everything he says and will not question it.
I do love that you've basically likened property developers to street fighters. Please know I'll be taking that analogy away with me today.
There's enough bodies in concrete to justify the analogy.
Listen, Dan, this has been a fascinating conversation today. I know next week we'll have some bigger numbers to chew over, and also to some new headlines to either support or dismiss that have come out of the US administration. Thank you so much for your time today. As always, I look forward to our next discussion.
Cheers.